Cool. Okay, I think we're live. Hello, everyone, and welcome. This is our last Freeplay online session. My name is Chad Toprak. I'm the director of Freeplay. I just wanted to welcome you to Freeplay 2018's online session. Freeplay is Australia's largest and longest running independent games festival. The festival is currently running in Melbourne, Australia all week. And we've got tickets to the conference still available. So if you want to buy tickets, you can find them at freeplay.net.au. If you'd like to join in on this conversation, you can use the hashtag Freeplay18. And you can also chat to us via the YouTube live chat box. Joining us is two special guests, Sarah Brin and Rosa.
My last name is difficult to pronounce, so don't worry if you get it wrong.
A little hard to pronounce, but maybe we can start off by some quick introductions, if that's okay.
Sure, I can have it. So I'm Sarah Brin. I'm an art historian and curator. I'm originally from California. I currently live in Copenhagen, where I'm doing research about playful experiences in museums. My curatorial practice has an emphasis on art in public space, and I currently participate in a program called Creative Producers International, which is about putting play at the heart of cities and city change.
Fantastic. I'm Rosa, and my last name is pronounced Carbo-Mascarell. So I've done a master's in game design where I researched into psychogeography of video games and written a paper around walking simulators. Currently, I run part of a studio called Digital Liberties, where we look at how play can influence politics, and we did a series of games such as Corbin Run, and now another game around social integration. I've done a fair amount of research into psychogeography and walking sims. I'm also a PhD candidate around that topic. So yeah, and done some games around cognitive maps and soundscapes and this.
Great. So before I disappear and leave the session to you, maybe we can just start off with answering the question that perhaps everyone's most curious about. And that question is, what is psychogeography and how does it relate to games? I'll leave you with that.
That's quite a big question, because you can kind of trace psychogeography all the way back to the Romantics and all the way forward to like urbex and urban exploration. But the term psychogeography was actually coined by a group of artists called the Situationists, Situationist International. And they were a group of artists in like the 1950s in Paris who believed that we are oppressed by capitalism through our environment. And a way to tear down capitalism was to get drunk and meander through Paris and use play as a way of getting people to kind of think twice about what influences them in the day-to-day.
I think that was very nicely said, and I just to kind of elaborate or just kind of springboard off from what you were saying. Some of you out there in the internet audience might also be familiar with situationist tactics for kind of scrambling that relationship that capitalism imprints on public space. And so one of those methods was called the dérive, which translates to drift, which would be kind of like playful methods for interacting with a city. So normally, or very frequently, you might find that our navigations through cities are directed towards a particular end goal, right? Of like, I want to get to work or I want to get to school. And so what a dérive might look like is like, you know, walk until you smell bread and then turn left and then go 50 paces until you see the color green. And so just an alternative way of shaping navigation through the city. And another situationist tactic for public space is making public spaces more playful. There's a strategy called détournement, which is kind of, I would say, kind of recontextualizing and scrambling elements of everyday life, again, like characterized by capitalism, and just kind of shifting those ubiquitous symbols or elements of popular culture to make them mean something different. And I think more contemporary examples of that is like the Billboard Liberation Front, where you have, billboards, big commercials in public space, and changing the messages on them to create kind of more subversive messages. So stuff adbusters do and stuff like that are just some examples of psychogeographic tactics.
A lot of people that also, the meme kind of originated through that as well, right? They were trying to go against the idea of the time that you had the radio or TV were one mode of communication towards the masses. And what they were trying to do was to say, no, let's try and give the masses a voice to kind of subvert that and for everyone to kind of democratize media.
So Rosa, I have a question for you. And maybe you have some thoughts on this, especially considering, Guy Debord and those earlier situationists, but also if you look at kind of more contemporary examples of games in public spaces, it seems like there's a connection between who gets to play in public space and who is allowed to play in public space. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about any connections you might see between like privilege and psychogeography or psychogeographic tactics.
Sure. Yeah. So I think I'm going to talk particularly about London because that's where I've kind of circled around. So there's a person called Richard Bradley Garrett who explored urban exploration groups. And what they do is that they try to infiltrate private spaces and abandoned places to kind of connect with the environment. They were famous because they went into the Shard when it was being built and climbed all the way to the top. And things like they went into the abandoned underground stations in London. Thing is, they post a lot of pictures on this forum that no one knew about until a journalist found out about this, and it became famous. And suddenly there was a court case around, oh, this is actually terrorism. So it started up a lot of conversation around, okay, well, who is allowed to go into spaces, and is the city actually public? There's areas like, for example, around the Scoop, it's called in London, which is where the mayor of London lives. And actually the entire area around it is private. So you're not allowed to do things like take photographs or do any sort of like things that might be dubious, right? But dubious can be interpreted in lots of different ways, which means that, hey, there's a homeless person here. We don't want that. They're loitering or just hanging about. Well, we own this space, so we can set the rules, and they can get kicked out. But you seem to have more practice with this.
No. I think you're what you're talking about, I think is right on the money. I think I'm from Los Angeles, and so in Los Angeles, a lot of times in public parks, especially the ones in nice areas, there are signs that say no organized physical activity. So if you want to go to a park in Los Angeles and do yoga or do hula hoop spinning or whatever, it's totally fine. But what that sign is a code to say no soccer or no football, as our friends in the UK and Australia would say. So like it's a way of being like, no, we don't want Mexicans in our parks. That's so. I also think as an American, it's very common, unfortunately, and extremely tragic to hear stories about people of color who are accomplishing or attempting to go through very normal aspects of their everyday life, carrying things like container of candy or a can of Coke, and being harassed by police for loitering or worse, being assaulted or killed. And I think when we think about like, oh, how magical it is to have a playful experience in public space, I think it's very easy to rely on the dynamics of privilege there. And I think that as a white person, it's much easier for me to feel empowered to do something zany in public spaces, like play a game. There's a Jane McGonigal and maybe Ian Bogos made this game called Cruel to Be Kind, and it was an early text message based game in which you played by complimenting players, and you didn't know who was playing and you didn't know who wasn't, and so your attack would be to do a random kind gesture for people on the street. And for me, it would be very easy to be like, oh yeah, like this is a fun game. But also, I think if people are already paying heightened attention to what you look like and are suspicious of you in public space, I think you might be much more hesitant to engage in kind of a whimsical behavior. And so that's why I'm kind of leery and critical of a lot of games in public space, because I think this is a topic that very frequently gets overlooked.
Yes, no, I agree. Yeah. And then this is something that actually has existed for a while. So going back to London, so like around the 1800s, there were lots of laws around who could walk at night, right? And this is the time when, lots of street lighting were being put up in cities. So, suddenly the middle class and upper class can now wander through the streets at night, and it feels more or less safe. However, this rule didn't apply to women. Anytime that there was a woman alone on the street, it was instantly assumed, oh, she's a prostitute, and therefore brought into jail. So being able to wander through the streets in the way that a lot of the romantics did, and a lot of the derive, the flaneur of the time, was actually cut off to a lot of women because it was considered obscene for a woman to walk on her own, because it was instantly assumed that she was a prostitute.
Yeah. Super duper complicated. And I think that I was just like, oh, like, are there games that kind of intentionally, deliberately kind of play with that idea? So like games designed for public space that kind of are kind of self-aware of that. And I guess the only instance I could think of that was kind of relevant was Akira Thompson had just amazing art for one person at a time, and it's very short, and it's called "And Maybe They Won't Kill You," and it was about that experience that I was just describing of being an African American person and just trying to do like a really simple thing, like going to the store and coming back. And it is a very sobering game, but also extremely thoughtfully done. But also, it's not necessarily explicitly a game for public space. I don't know. Do you know of any games that kind of work in that realm?
What that reminded me of was going more into digital games is Gone Home. So a lot of urban exploration, which is like entering abandoned buildings and like physical world, is actually quite male dominated, and there's quite a few women that do this practice. But a lot of the concept of people who do urban exploration, they're trying to go into a building and piece together kind of what happened there, or who lived there, or what was the vibe of the place. And Gone Home kind of encapsulates a lot of that as well. However, you're doing that from the safety of your home. So it's a way to kind of explore the same sort of like philosophies or the same sort of experience, but from within a video game.
That's cool. Yeah, I think that's a really that's like a really neat way to see it. And actually, now that we've been talking about it, I guess, so in the States, there's this thing called the Come Out and Play Festival, which is a festival of games in public space. It's going on for a long time. And it has multiple founders, but I remember when I was like early doing my master's research, and this was like in 2010, I was talking to Nick Fortuna, who's one of the founders, and I was asking him about like why he specifically like felt so motivated to start Come Out and Play, and this is started in New York, and there had been, I believe, the Republican National Convention, some national convention in New York, and then there was a big protest in the streets. And as folks were protesting, they were chanting the chant, "Whose streets? Our streets." And I think for that, in that particular moment, that was kind of a galvanizing moment in which Nick specifically saw it as a very political act to take to the streets in any fashion and occupy physical space in any way, and having that in and of itself be political. And I think I agree with him in that like there are some kind of really powerful connotations of claiming public space, because it is theoretically like, you know, shared and co-owned, and there's no real reason why the physical spaces need to be marked by capitalism, except for the fact that, like, you know, capitalism is pervasive and shapes everything, including the words we use. Yeah, so it's a complicated space. It's just, I guess in some ways, some parts of activism might be conceived as a privilege as well, but I think for some it's also a way of survival.
Yeah, yeah. My favorite like example of like public-private space was during actually the Occupy movement in London. So there's the London Stock Exchange, and originally there was a massive parade that protest that ran from one end of London to this location, and the plan was, once it ends, then we camp at the London Stock Exchange because we're trying to protest that bit. However, the London Stock Exchange is placed on private grounds. So they went there planning to camp, and then were instantly kicked out by police because, no, this is private ground, so we can't do that. And what was right next to the London Stock Exchange was St. Paul's Cathedral. So suddenly, and this was technically like Church of England territory. So they started camping on right by St. Paul's Cathedral. And suddenly it was the Archbishop started to having a conversation around, well, who does this space belong to?
That's cool. What a cool bishop.
Yeah, exactly. They ended up staying, but they had quite demarked lines of where they could camp and where they could not. And if they passed that, then police would come and kick them out. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I feel like the most popular or ubiquitous touch point most people have with games in public space is Pokemon Go. And unlike many of the examples that we were just talking about, or the intentions that we were just talking about, I think there is no explicit political objective of Pokemon Go. Although, of course, being created by a gigantic corporation with a huge IP and also the kind of monetary things that you can operationalize in the game, there's certainly political dimensions to Pokemon Go. But yeah, I guess there's still like a ton of daily players, even though there was like a huge drop off after the launch. But I wonder what that means for the future of games in public space, or if that was just like the moment in which AR arrived in that kind of.
Yeah. Although at the same time, I think there's saying, oh, it's Pokemon Go is like the thing that made us think about public space differently. It's like, actually, there's been people doing this kind of stuff way before then. Like, for example, Blast Theory, who have been doing games around public space since the 90s and have done a game similar to Pokemon Go in early 2000s.
Yeah, I worked with Blast Theory in my research, and they've done certainly some of my favorite works in public space. And yeah, one of my favorite projects of theirs is called A Machine to See With, in which they paired me with this stranger in San Jose, California, and we had to plan to rob a bank together, like a physical bank. And that was just so powerful. And I feel like the ways that they integrated the technology were just ways that supported the story, as opposed to like very kind of gimmicky, like, now we're gonna, you're gonna use your cell phone and you're gonna scan this QR code. It was just like all very kind of organic and seamless. And it was very clear that part of why it was so successful is because they had just done so much work observing the site in which it was staged, which I think is like a very obvious thing, but also a thing I see overlooked a lot when it comes to site-specific projects or playful experience in public space. And it's not just observing a site on a particular day at a particular time, it's observing it at night, alone, with people, multiple hours a day. And I think that these things kind of need to be tested and iterated, obviously.
One of my favorite projects from Blast Theory was actually the one that kind of saved them and made them famous in the 90s, which was Kidnap, where people wrote, you could apply to be kidnapped. And so people applied, they had to fill out this form and say anything like particular requests that you might have. Then you paid 20 quid, and then you might get kidnapped, you might not. They got tons of applicants, and then they ended up following, I think, 5 people. So they would follow these 5 people on their day-to-day, and then trace when would be the best moment to kidnap them. They would kidnap, like basically put a hood over their heads and like tie them up and throw them into a van, and then keep them for, I think it was 24 hours, just kidnapped, right? And that was literally like, is there something that we can do in someone's day-to-day that will draw them out of their monotone lifestyle and bring them on an experience? And lots of people really want that.
Yeah, it is really interesting how how much people will pay to be traumatized.
Yes. Life has got too boring. We need to
there's like another company I really love called Odyssey Works, and I believe they're based in Southern California. And what they will do is they will produce elaborate, highly researched theatrical performances for one person, which I think is so cool and so exciting. And of course, privilege factors in like so much to that. But I also like, who wouldn't be so charmed by that detail of experience and observation? Like the movie The Game. I love the movie The Game with Michael Douglas. It's excellent. I also love Nonchalance, who there's a documentary about their work. They're situational engineers, and what they made is an alternative reality game based in San Francisco, in which every single neighborhood, or not every single, each different neighborhoods in the city represented different levels of the game. And so they would have like tiny dioramas hidden in the middle of the city, secret arcades you could access by like solving puzzles, and like they brought in stores, it was just like a very, very kind of elaborate layer of super reality on top of regular reality, which I think was very, very dreamy. And of course, like when you do stuff like art, when you like are making secret things in public space, like dissemination becomes, or adoption becomes a really tricky problem, right? So like when you're doing something, a game in public space, how do you recruit people to play? Like, do you just make an agreement with your pals to show up a particular place in a particular time? And like, what is the protocol when someone comes up to you and asks, what are you doing? Do you invite them to play? Do you pretend like nothing's happening? Like, has anything like that ever happened to you?
Actually, so I have a friend who runs like immersive theater type experiences with a company called Blogstop. And one of the things so together with my friends who are, they're game designers, they decided for my birthday to organize a massive immersive experience through London, where they said, you need to go and save this friend from getting poisoned because, she's going to save the future. So you need to get to this pub and stop her from drinking this poisoned glass or whatever. But the entire experience was them like kind of like chasing me through the streets of London, and I was crawling into people's backyards. To try to escape them. And and like my favorite bit was like I was on the tube and they were further ahead of me, and they didn't spot me until we got to our stop, and I had to jump out, and they spotted me, and I ran through King's Cross like just dashing through people. to try and evade them. But it's that situation where people kind of look like, why is she running? Probably she's just late to a meeting or something, right? Because it's not so unusual to see that in London. But still, there was like this narrative on top of like the normal day-to-day, which later on, you know, we'll walk through streets and go like, oh, this is where, you know, this happened. And
yeah, I think, and I know Chad mentioned at the beginning that if any of you are watching and if you have questions for us, please feel free to pop them in to Twitter or whatever other vehicles you have for contacting us. Otherwise, we're just gonna jam. we're gonna jazz this. But we're experts. Yes, so I taught a class called Locative Media this semester, and it was a bachelor's level class in Copenhagen, and I was really apprehensive about it because I've taught a bunch before, but in the US and not in Denmark, and the class went really well. Like definitely surpassed my expectations. I was really impressed with the projects the students developed, but I do think that the nuances of public space and the kind of tropes of public space vary so much from region to region in ways that you wouldn't normally expect. And so like, I think jaywalking is a really funny manifestation of that. Like in Los Angeles, like first of all, no one walks, but if you did walk, you could jaywalk. And if you're in New York, like of course, jaywalking is a way of life. If you try to jaywalk in Denmark, even if it's the middle of the night, if there's one other person on the street, you're gonna get a stern look from them. And one specific project that I was teaching my students about was this thing called critical mass. Are you familiar with critical mass?
Critical mass.
It's like critical mass. It's
critical mass. Like yes, critical mass.
Yeah. So for all you at home, it's kind of like a cyclist activism program that happens once a month, in which cyclists en masse will overwhelm a street, so making it impenetrable to car traffic. And where I come from, this is a really cool and also very radical thing, because bike lanes are very sparse, and also like Los Angeles is a very, very car-dominated place. But I was talking to my students about this, and I was just like, "Art, isn't this such a cool radical gesture?" And the students are like, "Why don't they just use the bike lane?" And I was like, "No, it's because
that's not the point."
But in Denmark, cycling is I would say much more popular. Yeah, and like there's protected bike lanes, which is incredible. But some things just don't translate.
It's like definitely like the walkability of cities becomes like really obvious. So there's a famous writer, Will Self, who literally said, well, there's some areas that you literally just can't walk to. And also a lot of our mental maps of spaces are quite fragmented, right? We get on public transport or some form of transport and then pop up somewhere else. Therefore, our maps are kind of disjointed, right? We have a mental image of where like this area is, or like, I don't know, some district of the city. And then we get on the tube and then we appear in this other district of the city, but we don't know what's in between. So one thing that he tried to do was to walk from his house to London airport, jump on a plane, get off in New York, and walk to the hotel as a way to try and connect these two cities, like in his head. And the things that you start to notice is like suddenly you're like walking on cold shoulders, or areas that are not built for walking but built for the car, for example. And he calls it like, he really hates cars.
Yeah.
For that reason.
With good reason. I think Jan Gehl, who is like a famous Danish urban planner, I forgot the percentage, but like his strategy was to just reduce the number of parking spaces in Copenhagen by, I think it was like something like 10 or 15% per year. And if you look at photographs from then and now, it's an amazing piece of streets. Previously, I was just like built so many cars, and just like it's slow, but also like, it deliberately, like, you can make change. And I think the way we plan cities isn't always dependent on, or it doesn't always consider walking or bicycling. Like, again, like I bring up Los Angeles for the millionth time. Like, LA has no city or city center, and it is sprawling. And in some ways, like, I feel like it's similar to London in that, like, it's just like long. Yeah, there's so many kind of micro neighborhoods.
Yeah. But I mean, I haven't been to LA, but in London, you often have to say it is sprawling, but it's historic. It has been built originally with the concept of walking in mind. And the only bits where that starts to kind of distort itself is when you get to an area of London called Stratford, where they kind of like uprooted everything and for the London Olympics and created the London Olympic Park, and then this massive mall right next to it. And when you walk through there, you start feeling how everything's just gigantic, because originally it had the car in mind, right? They had, oh, well, you're going to drive here and drive to the mall and drive, to the Olympic Park. And so when you spent like 15 minutes maybe just like walking along the side of this mall. And by the way, it's like the biggest in Europe, which I don't know how that compares to US standards. And there's this weird disjoint between walking that in London, like walking along the mall for 15 minutes and you're still alongside the mall, and then walking in central London, where in 15 minutes you've gone from Covent Garden through lots of like different types of streets down to Trafalgar Square, for example.
That's super interesting. Also, I believe it. It looks like we have a couple questions. So can you talk a bit more about the relationship between psychogeography and capitalism, and does this relationship transfer over to video games at all? We have another question, but I want to let you start to answer that one first, because I don't work so much with video games.
Sure. I mean, psychogeography, okay, so we've kind of gone down like the political side of psychogeography. It's actually, over the past like few years, it's split into a political psychogeography and a literal psychogeography. I think a lot of the, at least video games right now, are more exploring the literal psychogeography at the moment. So you have games like Dear Esther, particularly, or Gone Home, or Edith Finch, where they're instead looking at our psychology and how that is expressed in the form of landscape. Proteus is another one, I think. So I'm not sure that really answers it, but
yeah, I can try to guess that too. So I am a person who believes that capitalism is a completely pervasive system, and that it shapes the way we speak, it shapes the way we work, it shapes the way we play. And so I would say that psychogeography can be seen as an attempt to escape, or at least to rearrange, the way capitalism shapes those things. But of course, just like every other part of culture, psychogeography, while it was originally developed to be a radical practice, has been kind of reappropriated and recontextualized and commodified. So of course you can pay money to go on these kind of like alternative explorations of public spaces or sewers, and as kind of like a service. And also, does that translate to video games? I think that the representation of space is in games is often one shaped by capital, and of course video games themselves are very frequently modified objects. But I would also say, Proteus, for example, I would say that in some ways it is quite radical, because it is a imagined space. So in some ways it is not, as explicitly marked by capitalism as a more traditionally urban space would be. But then it gets kind of more in the weeds, then I won't do that. But we have so many more questions. Great. Okay. Do situationists still exist today? Are there people or groups who derive through the city?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. I mean, in London, I can name like Ian Sinclair, Nick Papadimitriou, Will Self. I think those are the most like famous psychogeographers right now in London. There's a museum of psychogeography in London as well, and a lot of the documents there were donated by a guy called Fabian Tomset, who I work with, and Richard Barbrook as well looks at the more political side of things. So those are the ones I can think of.
Yeah, Rebecca Solnit's book, Invisible
Rebecca
City,
Solnit, yeah.
This is like a really cool study of different ways to map a place. And while I wouldn't say that she explicitly uses the term psychogeography because it's really kind of loaded in terms of association with that kind of situationist mode, I would say that there's a lot of similar practices that she adopts. What does psychogeographic activism look like today? Can it prevent or roll back capitalist encroachment on public spaces? Oh boy, what do you think?
So I was recently, it was a year ago, at the Scoop with Will Self and Bradley Garrett. And a lot of that was to try and point out that that was a private space. So what we did is like we organized a whole bunch of people, got together in this private space, which was technically like kind of like not allowed, but you know, where's the law there, right? Who is actually imposing those laws? And that itself was a comment on, look, we can't protest right in front of where politics is happening. And to do all these, you know, subversive things like, oh, you can't actually take photographs here. So, you know, we all took our cameras out and took pictures, and you know, it was more of like to try and get the public to realize that this was private space, right? Yeah, I don't know, what sort of activities have you done or know of?
Well, in terms of psychogeographic activism, I think that, and if it can prevent or roll back capitalist encroachment of public space, I would say psychogeography as a tactic, and this is me speaking personally, is maybe a bit too abstract to be effectively operationalized as a tactic for direct activism. I would say it is a cool and creative way to see public space and to imagine the potentials of public space. But if I wanted something to change explicitly, I would not adopt situationist or psychogeographic tactics. However, I do think that there are lots of really amazing ways you can creatively occupy public space as a way to accomplish activist objectives, whether or not they really relate to capitalism. So there's a really cool book, and it's also a website. I'm trying to see if I have it on my shelf. I don't think I do right now. Called Beautiful Trouble, and it is a kind of manual for activist tactics, and a lot of them involve strategies in public space. So some of those or like blockades, or flash mobs, or billboard alterations, and I think that those can be operationalized specifically in order to kind of respond.
Yeah. To those phenomena. One of the things I want to mention is so there's also the creation of video games as well, as a way to kind of like tackle issues. So one of the games that we did for the Labour Party was a game called Corbyn Run, and that was quite actively trying to say, look, this is what the Labour Party stand for, kind of, and use a playful medium as a way to kind of express this message. And you know, we're at that stage right now where people kind of go like, oh my God, this political figure has a video game, suddenly like it explodes. But that's one of the potential ways, I think, that current psychogeography and activism is being used.
Where was he running in the game? Like in a physical space?
Yeah, it was an infinite, well, not exactly infinite because it did end after like 5 minutes, but it was like a street of London, like a street of London. Yeah. Was
it like a real street or just like a imaginary street?
It was a generated street, but we used a lot of the
I think digital representations or fictional or recreational representations of cities is so fascinating. I think it's just like what do you decide to collapse? What do you decide to omit? Like, how do you rearrange places? Like, I think like the GTA games do that very interestingly. You know, just like you can really tell which cities are what. And I think that is
my favorite
really,
representation
really cool.
in a video game. It was oh, I don't remember the name now, but it was a representation of London, and you could kind of tell that it was actually done by Americans, because there was this toilet stall in supposedly a London pub, which was as big as a flat in London, which was particularly amazing. It was just like this massive cubicle. It was, yeah, and anyone in London would be like, wait, that's what? My entire flat fits in there.
That's really funny. There's this Skyrim question. Do you see the Skyrim question in the chat? I don't know. Do you want to take that one?
Does a game like Skyrim encapsulate aspects of psychogeography? You're mostly out in the landscape, but a lot of the game is spent wandering semi-randomly in the target direction, paying more attention to the landscape than the destination. Yes. So Skyrim actually encapsulates a lot of the older notions of psychogeography. So before it was actually called psychogeography, which I link it more to the Romantic movement. And these, you know, the Romantics kind of came in at a time where industrialization was taking over the landscape and rational thought. And they were wondering, well, are there things that we still do not understand? And where's the spirituality when everything can start to be explained? Is there something maybe in us that we don't yet understand, or concepts in the world that we do not yet understand? So the way that they went about that was to take walks. And this is when you get into concepts of like the sublime and things bigger than yourself, like God, like spirituality and all these things, which is encapsulated by the figure of the man above the sea cloud, wonder above the sea cloud, which is like the person standing on a mountaintop, their back towards the onlooker, overlooking like this landscape. And I think a lot of video games incorporate that notion, particularly Skyrim, right, where you're a single person taking on things bigger than yourself. I mean, I could go into a big rabbit hole there, but I'm gonna stop there.
Thinking about the Romantic period, like, would you still use that term, psychogeography? Like, would you still use that word to describe what they're doing?
Yeah, I think it's like an old tradition that kind of like, you know, the term psychogeography was coined later, but a lot of the thought kind of you can trace back to that Romantic period, where that's where they started to think about landscape in terms of like something bigger, right? There were writers like Chesterton who, you know, sat down on the cliffs of Dover and said, the chalk is the ultimate spiritual symbol, and then realized, oh, it's literally sitting on a piece of chalk, so the whole landscape is full of spirit. And then you start going into, you know, as time continued, you start getting into like the surrealists and Walter Benjamin, who looked at, well, if you can explore your subconscious, or you can walk for so long that you start hallucinating, and that's a way of exploring your subconscious. And the surrealists used to do this, where they would walk for so long that they would start hallucinating, and those hallucinations express themselves in the landscape. So the landscape started becoming representation of their psychology. And then it goes on to the Flaneur, and you know, you can trace it then to psychogeographers and looking at how landscape can influence us. And
I guess I use that term to describe like a really specific kind of moment in time, and I might say like psychogeography if I'm talking about practices that happen now. But the word I like is peripatetic, which comes kind of like almost a more monastic philosophical tradition, where there's like a school of philosophers who their jams, they would just like walk while they did philosophy. And I think that's super cool, because I do believe that you have different types of thoughts when you're walking and when you're moving through space. And like there's like the idea that you have additional stimuli, you know, just that you encounter as you move. But also I believe that when you're active, there's so many different types of intelligence, and there's not just like the thinky, wordy intelligence. I think that when you use other types of your body, like you might be able to integrate or create kind of different types of understandings or connect ideas in different ways that you might not be able to do that otherwise.
But maybe
people don't use it because it's hard to say Arabic.
Yes.
Okay, are there groups of people or groups or people who reject the notion of psychogeography? Are there alternative schools of thought or approaches? Yes. I mean, I don't think you're going to find anyone who rejects psychogeography by saying it doesn't exist and it never did. But I do think you would find people who would say that it is like a really kind of problematic practice. And I would be one of those people, right? So like, it's just that's my, I kind of like, it was slightly unfortunate that we didn't have a moderator, because I was just like, right, I'm not going to be shy about my opinions about the fact that like privilege and power shape the way we use public space. And I think that it's imperative to be more intersectional about how we think about the different experiences folks have in public space. And so what I would say is kind of looking more towards intersectionality and looking more towards activist discourses would have kind of different theorizations of public space. And I think also looking at Rebecca Solnit's work, but of course, like so many of the theorists who have theorized public space in general have been white fellas, white European fellas, like Bachelard, Lefebvre, Debord, and so Benjamin. Yeah, and so I think I would be really interested to have more voices, more different voices in that kind of discourse. What do you think?
No, absolutely. And there's like, for example, Rebecca Solnit does go into like, well, a lot of like the conversations around walking is, well, it comes from men because they had the right to walk than women, right? So she goes into like the whole history of that, which is fantastic. Yeah, well, there's one book that I like that recently came out called The Flaneurs, which was looking at, right, there were all these men taking strolls through cities and falling in love with women as they walked, right? Who were these women in the first place? They were also walking. They were also like going through an experience. So who were they? You know, a lot of them have been kind of written out of history. Which is fantastic that reaches has come out.
Yeah, like that song, The Girl from Ipanema. I don't know if you know that song. It's an old like Frank Sinatra era song, and like it's kind of catchy, but it's like about street harassment, and it's just like tall and young and lovely. The girl from Ipanema goes walking, and as she goes walking, the men go ooh, which I think is so messed up and like really is appropriate. That is an icon of that era of the 1950s of just like truly aestheticizing the feeling of being unsafe in a public space. So I guess as practitioners, as designers, as theorists, we all need to be more thoughtful and continue to be thoughtful about the ways privilege, power, and technology all manifest in public space.
Yep.
We've got 5 minutes left, but I don't know. Do you have any closing remarks for us? I feel like I put a button on it.
Yeah. I mean, there's one thing about walking that I think can't really be expressed in video games, which is the concept of, right, we were talking about walking and the rhythm of walking becoming a way to kind of jog your mind and to kind of like, you know, all these walkers used to go for such long walks that they would end up, you know, hallucinating. That can only happen because your body's exhausted. Whereas that can't really be expressed in a video game, like not a physical game, like a video game. So it's kind of interesting to see, you know, walking simulators where you're pressing just W to walk when actually the rhythm of walking was such an important aspect of getting at those stories. So yeah, that's one aspect of video games I'm not quite sure if we'll ever answer.
I mean,
Or I would really like to see video games that use that rhythm in a more interesting way.
Certainly, there are exhausting video games.
Yeah.
And games that are deliberately exhausting, so maybe Bennett Foddy's Walk will be.
I like that.
Yeah. You're welcome, Bennett. All right. Thanks so much, the internet. Thanks so much, Rosa. It was really nice chatting with you.
Yeah, you too. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah. Okay. I think that we're going to scoot. Thanks so much for having us, Freeplay.
Thank you.
I'm going to hang up the call. See you later, internet and the world. Bye.